First tonight, Qatar has announced that the four-day halt to the fighting in Gaza, agreed by Israel and Hamas, will begin on Friday at 7 a.m. local time. Speaking in Doha, Foreign Ministry spokesman Majid al-Ansari said a list of hostages to be released has been handed over to the Israeli intelligence service. He said 13 from the first batch of 50 hostages will be released at 4 p.m. local time. Palestinian prisoners from Israel are also to be freed. Much needed humanitarian aid is expected to cross from Rafah into Gaza in the hours that follow. Hamas says 200 aid lorries and 4 trucks of fuel will enter Gaza daily. The deal was reached after weeks of negotiations mediated by Qatar alongside the US and Egypt.
We have just finished with all the communication with all parties in order to ascertain the lists of those civilians who will be freed as a result of the deal agreed upon by both parties. The lists have been handed to both sides, and finally, in a communication just now, the list has been handed to the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad, in order to facilitate the implementation of the deal. The beginning of the pause will be 7 a.m. Friday, the 24th of November, and it will last, of course, as agreed, for 4 days. And the first batch of civilians to be released from Gaza will be around 4 p.m. of the same day. They will be 13 in number, all women and children, and those hostages who are from the same families will be put together within the same patch. Obviously, every day will include a number of civilians, as agreed, to total 50 within the 4 days.
Well, ahead of the ceasefire, Israel is continuing its deadly attacks across Gaza. Strikes targeted central and northern parts of the Strip. The health ministry said Israeli bombs on a residential building in Gaza City killed and wounded several people. And areas in central Gaza have been under heavy shelling. Israeli warplanes targeted homes in Deir al-Balah and the Nusayrat refugee camp. At least 8 Palestinians have been killed in those attacks. Overnight airstrikes also hit the Al-Bureij refugee camp, wounding many. The Israeli army has arrested the director of the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City. Mohammed Abu Salmiya and several doctors were detained earlier today. At least 180 patients remain trapped inside the facility. Meanwhile, in northern Gaza, the Israeli army has ordered the evacuation of the Indonesian hospital. On Wednesday, around 450 patients were moved out of the facility, but another 200 remain inside. Both hospitals have come under repeated attacks by Israel. Well, as the world waits for the ceasefire agreement to start, the United Nations says Gaza is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. Agencies charged with helping women and children in conflict briefed members of the Security Council on Wednesday. It's reported that 5,300 Palestinian children have been killed since Israel began its bombing campaign on Gaza.
Today, the Gaza Strip is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. No place is safe in the Gaza Strip, and the proposed zones do not have the infrastructure or protection measures in place to meet the needs of such large numbers of civilians. We are particularly concerned by reports of increasing numbers of displaced children who have been separated from their families along evacuation corridors to the south, or who are otherwise arriving unaccompanied to hospitals for medical care. These children are especially vulnerable, and they urgently need to be identified, provided with temporary care, and given access to family tracing and reunification services.
Well, for more on all this, let's cross live to the Israeli city of Tel Aviv and speak with Arise special correspondent Karl Bostic. Good to see you, Karl. Let's start with that deal. A deadline was missed at first, then Qatari officials in the last 3 hours or so laying out how the short truce will work from Friday onwards at first light. Bring us the details that you know.
That's right. Good evening, Charles. Well, if today is any indication, we can expect these hiccups over the next 3 days or few days or so. Very simply, Charles, it boiled down to numbers, disagreement over just how many hostages are there in Gaza, and then also how many are alive. Essentially, the main sticking point, according to the Egyptian officials, is that Hamas would not or could not provide a complete list for the first 13 names. And that was not done in time for the original deadline that was missed for this morning. So that was one of the sticking points right there. Also, Hamas had insisted on delivering the hostages to Egypt at the Rafah crossing. Israel refused. Israel wanted them delivered to the Red Cross, and Hamas refused. And then in the end, after back and forth discussions, Red Crescent will be the ones taking custody of the hostages in Gaza, and then Red Crescent will hand over to Red Cross. Perhaps part of the back and forth discussions, because any movement of hostages will, yield or give information, intelligence about where the hostages were being held or where they were coming from. Also, in terms of the aid trucks, you mentioned there'll be 200 trucks a day beginning at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning, additional to 4 trucks of fuel and cooking gas. Well, Charles, putting things in perspective, before the war, back in August, for example, you had 1,200 trucks of fuel and cooking gas each month, about 40 trucks a day. This is only a fraction. This is only about a tenth of the necessary fuel for hospitals, bakeries, cars, you name it. So this is a first step for this deep, deep mistrust, Charles, on both sides. And if today was an indication about how much had to be navigated, we can expect the same tomorrow.
And the position, of course, of Prime Minister Netanyahu, Karl, is unquestionably that the fighting will resume just as fiercely several days later after this expected truce expires. In other words, the truce is not a signal that Israel is going to lower the tempo of its military campaign.
That's right, Charles. In fact, he had a very controversial press conference last night where he announced the delay, which surprised everyone because they thought they'd be going to bed with news they'd be coming this morning. But then he ended the press conference saying that our mission, our war will go on until we eliminate Hamas. In other words, he's basically saying we're going to find the ones behind this and we're going to kill them. And the relatives were upset because they felt this might just make it more difficult to get that release. Also, keep in mind, Charles, once that 4-day threshold is reached, if Hamas continues to release more prisoners in groups of at least 10, Israel will extend it by another day. And keeping in mind also one final detail, for every Israeli hostage or the hostage that is released, 3 Palestinian women and children prisoners, children 19 years and under, will be released. So in other words, for those 50 hostages, at a ratio of 3 to 1, 150 Palestinians will be released over the 4-day period.
Meanwhile, of course, Gaza still teeming with grief and desperation as the dead bodies pile up.
That's right, Charles. In fact, it's been so chaotic over the past month, Charles. You have increasing numbers of mass graves. The Indonesia hospital you talked about, there are at least 60 bodies piled up outside the morgue that had not been buried yet. And the funerals, the burials that are being held right now are being held so quickly, they don't even involve family members because they can't find them. And they're only maybe just lasting a few minutes. But this is all also a part of Israel wanting to do as much bombardment they can up until the very last hour before the ceasefire, basically to let Hamas know this is what we can do up to the last minute, but also to say that without this kind of pressure and bombardment, we would not have gotten this far that could lead to the results of the first groups of hostages.
Karl, thanks very much indeed. Karl Bostic is our ICE special correspondent. He's talking to me there from the Israeli city of Tel Aviv.